What do consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus measure? Let's say we begin with consumer surplus. What is consumer surplus? Consumer surplus is the difference between two things. One, what is the willingness to pay? How much is a consumer willing to pay? Less. What is the amount paid? The gap between what a consumer is willing to pay and what a consumer actually pays, that is known as consumer surplus. Now, the second thing is producer surplus. What is producer surplus? So, producer surplus is the gap between two things, which is the price of the product less what is the cost to the supplier. This is his surplus to the producer. So producer surplus measures benefit sellers receive from participating in the market. Consumer surplus is benefit buyers receive from participating in the market. When we add consumer and producer surplus together, sorry, that is known as total surplus. So total surplus is the total gain from trade in the market. Consumer surplus plus producer surplus together is known as total surplus. Now, these are the following questions we intend to ask. First of all, we always say that, let the market act to themselves and the market will do what is in the best interest of the buyers and sellers. The question is, how should this be guaranteed? The question is, how do we say that in a market economy, allocation of resources decentralized, it is determined by interaction of self-interested buyers and sellers? The question is market's allocation desirable or should we make another allocation? Well, for answering what happens in the market, and whatever happens, if that is efficient or not, what we can go ahead and do is that we can talk about total surplus. Total surplus is a good measure to check what happens in the market. Total surplus basically helps us understand whether the society's well-being is considered or not. So total surplus is a measure of the well-being of the society. How do we measure total surplus? Now, if you notice, consumer surplus is willingness to pay by the consumer minus the price actually paid. The price that the consumer pays, that's the price that the producer receives minus the cost of production, that is his surplus. Total surplus is adding the two things together. If I add these two things together, I will be able to cancel out the price with price and I will be left up with willingness to pay minus willingness to sell or the cost to the producer. This is known as total surplus. So total surplus is the value to the buyer minus the cost to the seller. Let's go ahead and understand this thing once. If I go ahead and I have to prepare a diagram of market efficiency, let us say that I have a demand curve and let us say that I have a supply curve, and wherever demand is equal to supply, that is my equilibrium. And from my equilibrium, I get my equilibrium price and quantity. What was consumer surplus? Consumer surplus was area below the demand curve above the price. So if I go ahead and I check this, my consumer surplus will be area below demand curve and above the price. What is producer surplus? It is area below price above the supply curve. So if I go ahead and I check, then this is my producer surplus, below price, above the supply curve. And if I look at these two things together, then this will be my total surplus. Now, any allocation is said to be efficient if it maximizes this total surplus. Whenever you increase total surplus, that is going towards that efficient outcome. Now, let's say that we have the following. Supposedly, I tell you that I want to go ahead and I want to increase or decrease the quantity. Will that change the total surplus? No, not really. If I tell you that, I reduce the cost of production, or let's say that the goods that are produced are or consumed are those which the consumer values the most, will those go ahead and will those change the total surplus? That is what my analysis is all going to be. So my analysis now is going to be revolved around three things. Which goods are being produced? Are the goods that are being produced, are those goods being produced with the minimum cost? Are the goods that are being consumed by the buyers, are those buyers the one who are valuing them the most? That is what my efficiency is going to go ahead and make. So efficiency is basically dependent only on total surplus. And when we talk about total surplus, from the formula, we know that total surplus is value to buyer minus cost to seller. So in order to increase total surplus, there are only two ways to play around this. Either you decrease the cost to seller. When you decrease the cost to seller, automatically the total surplus will increase. Or you go ahead and increase the value to buyer. When you increase the value to buyer, that will also increase total surplus. So two ways: increase this, that will increase this, or decrease this, that will also increase this. This is how you can go ahead and change the efficiency in the economy. Okay, so this is what we have written here. You give goods to those consumers who value them the most, which means you increase the value to the buyers, or you produce the goods by the producer which have the lowest cost, which means you reduce the cost to the seller. Either ways, it is going to go ahead and increase the total surplus. Now, this is efficiency. Efficiency means making the pie as big as possible. Now, what is equity? Equity is basically giving this, whatever pie it is, whatever the total surplus is, distribution of this total surplus. The distribution of the total surplus, that is equity. Equity is dependent on how fairly it is distributed. And fairness is a subjective concept. Okay, fairness is a subjective concept. So let's go ahead and let's look here. So why is fairness a subjective concept? For me, fairness would mean that you give more to the lower group, low income group, and less to the high income group. For a person belonging to high income group, he may think that he's getting more money because he's putting more hard work. So fairness would mean let things be as it is. So fairness is a subjective concept. Equity is a subjective concept. We are not here to discuss equity. We are here to understand what is efficiency, which means we are here to understand how can we deal with total surplus. Now, let's take an example. So let's say that I have a demand curve and a supply curve, and the demand and the supply are meeting at a price of 30 and the equilibrium quantity is 15. What will be consumer surplus? Half into base into height. What is the height? And Remember, consumer surplus was area above the price below the demand curve. So this. So what is the half into base into height for this? It is going to be half. Base is 15. Height is this gap, which is 30. So this will be 225. So the consumer surplus is 225. What is producer surplus? Well, the producer surplus is area below the price above the supply curve. So you go ahead and you find half into base into height again. Base will be same, 15, and height will be, this is supposedly 15, so height will be 15. So this will be 225 by 2, 112.5. This will be your producer surplus. So you have been able to get both your consumer and producer surplus. Now the question is the following. Is this market equilibrium efficient? To check if the market equilibrium is efficient or not, we are asking two questions. First, are those consumers getting the product who value it the most? Second, are those producers selling it who have the least cost? These are the two questions that we are asking. So let's talk about the consumer first. Which buyers are getting to consume the product? That is my first question. Now please see, if the price is 30 and the demand curve represents the willingness to pay, then every buyer whose willingness to pay is above 30 is going to buy the product, because this is your willingness to pay, you're only paying less. Your willingness to pay is more, you're paying less. Your willingness to pay is more, you're paying less. Your willingness to pay is more, you're paying less. Your willingness to pay is more, you are paying less. Your willingness to pay is more, you are paying less. So every buyer whose willingness to pay is greater than equal to 30 will definitely buy the product. Good enough. Any buyer whose willingness to pay is less than 30, like for example here, he is not buying the product. The quantity sold is not more than 15. Only 15 people are exactly buying the product. So every buyer whose willingness to pay is less than 30 will not buy the product because the price of the product is 30. So this is clear from here that the buyer who value the most are the one who are consuming it. So we are able to check this out. Now let's go ahead and ask which seller are selling the product. Now the cost of production is given by the supply curve, or the willingness to sell is given by the supply curve. Now when the price is 30 and cost is less, he's making profit, he's selling it. This person is also selling it, this is also selling it, this person is also selling it. But for this person right here, whose cost of production is more than 30, I got his cost of production from his supply curve, his cost is more than the price. And since the cost is more than the price, he will not be able to sell the product, isn't it? So every seller whose cost is less than equal to 30 will produce the good. Every seller whose cost is more than 30 will not. So the seller with the lowest cost will only produce the good. So that is also satisfied. So which means, yes, the equilibrium is maximizing the total surplus. Now let's say that I go ahead and I say that let the quantity be 20 units. Now, if the quantity is brought to 20 units, equilibrium is 15, where demand is equal to supply. But I increase the quantity to 20 units, then at 20 units from the supply curve gives me the cost. So it makes me understand that the cost is 35 for producing the 20th unit, right? So from supply curve, I drag this Q equal to 20 to the supply curve, and I check that the corresponding cost is coming at 35. I drag this 25 to the demand curve and I check that the willingness to pay is only coming at 20. So if the consumer is willing to pay 20, but the cost is 35, neither consumer nor producer will be able to sell or buy. So, the producer will not be able to sell because his cost is 35. He wants the price to be more than 35. The consumer will not buy it because he wants the price to be less than 20. But these are two conflicting things. So therefore, for this, you will not be able to go ahead and sell that product, sell that unit. You can in fact increase this surplus, increase the total surplus by reducing the quantity. So you can only do maximum surplus at this equilibrium quantity. Same here. Suppose you want to start with 10 units. At 10 units, what is the willingness to pay? 40. What is the cost? Only 25. So the cost is 25. The willingness to pay is 40. So if the cost is less and the willingness to pay is more, why stop at 10? You easily know that the consumer can pay up to 40 and you only need 25. So you will sell this unit. You will sell more because consumer is willing to pay. And if you keep selling more, you will reach towards 15. So you can increase the surplus by increasing the quantity because you know that consumers are willing to pay more than what your cost is. So as long as this gap exists, this is the gap between what consumer is willing to pay and what your cost is. If this gap is positive, you should keep selling more. Because you know that the consumer wants to pay more, your cost is less, you sell that unit. Consumer wants to pay more, your cost is less, sell the unit. Consumer wants to pay more, your cost is less, sell. Consumer wants to pay exactly equal to your cost, sell. So you will keep increasing till this. And if you're here, then consumer wants to pay less, your cost is more, don't sell, don't sell, don't sell, reduce. So this is the optima. This is where demand is equal to supply, where exactly the willingness to pay becomes equal to your cost and you stop. You can't sell more than that because consumer is paying exactly equal to your cost. So that is why we can say that the market equilibrium is in fact efficient. It is able to maximize the total surplus. You don't want to sell less than the market equilibrium. You don't want to sell more than the market equilibrium. This is not what you want to do. At market equilibrium, producers are selling at the lowest cost and the consumers who are buying it value them the most. So basically, no government intervention is required. Market equilibrium in itself is efficient. And this is known as laissez-faire. Laissez-faire means leave the market to itself. Let the market be free. Let the market itself do things for itself. Let these self-interested parties do things for themselves. They will automatically come towards the equilibrium. We don't need any role of the government. We don't need any external intervention. Let the invisible hand do its role and that will gain its efficiency. So why are non-market allocations usually bad? Non-market allocations are usually bad because they cannot know what the willingness to pay and willingness to sell for each consumer and producer is. They impose an outcome which is not efficient. Okay, so market allocations are not very useful. Now let's read this through. So suppose allocation of resources are determined by the central planner. To know the efficient allocation, the planner would need to know every seller's cost and buyer's willingness to pay, which is impossible. You cannot know about every buyer and seller. So because it is impossible for you to know what is the willingness to pay of each buyer, what is the cost of each seller. So it is impossible for you to go ahead and know that. You will definitely go ahead and impose an outcome which will not be efficient. So it is practically impossible. So central planned economies are not very efficient. Adam Smith gave this invisible hand theory. He said, let the markets be to themselves. There is an invisible hand. There is this person, invisible hand, which will do its job, which means that this is like a quite literal transformation, but it means that let the markets be to themselves. The self-interested parties will do what is in their interest. You do not have to go ahead and you don't have to, intervene in the market, right? Okay, now let's see what we have done. This chapter used welfare economics to demonstrate one very important thing, which is markets are usually a good way to do economic activity. Markets, when kept to themselves, will make sure that you reach the right equilibrium. However, in this chapter, we assumed perfect competition. In the real world, we have something which is known as market failure. Market failure is when markets fail, when prices are not enough in the market. There are various examples of market failure. The first is market policy, market power. Like for example, when you have a monopoly over something, say monopoly over making vaccines of COVID-19, then in that case, what will happen? If you have a monopoly over making vaccines of COVID-19, then in that case, nobody else can make those vaccines and you can charge whatever price you want. But if you can charge whatever price you want, you will charge the highest price possible. So in this case, you want government to intervene. So whenever we have market power, whenever we have a single buyer who influences the market, we need government intervention. Second, externalities. Whenever you have transactions which cannot be shown with the help of prices, which cannot be reflected in the market. For example, pollution, right? Pollution is affecting the health of people. Because health is getting affected, people are spending more on healthcare. But we cannot show this pollution as a market transaction. Nobody's paying when they're causing pollution in the market. So that is again something where we would need government intervention. When markets fail, public policy is required to increase the efficiency. Welfare economics will shed light on market failure and government policies, right? But this is something we will see over time. So, a lot of this is going to come in your intermediate economics, intermediate micro, and your public economics is all about this. But for now, you just have to remember that if it is perfect competition, then markets are the best. They will give you efficient outcome. But if there is a market failure, then in that case, government intervention may be required. Okay, chapter summary. The height of the demand curve reflects the value to the buyer or the willingness to pay. Consumer surplus is different between willingness to pay and the price paid. Consumer surplus is the area between the price and the demand curve. Height of supply curve gives you seller's cost of producing the good. Sellers are willing to sell if the price is more than their cost. Producer surplus is difference between the price received and the cost of producing. Diagrammatically, producer surplus is area between the price and the supply curve. Society's well-being is measured by total surplus. It is sum of consumer and producer surplus. Efficiency is when total surplus is maximized. Because total surplus is willingness to pay minus cost, so you can maximize total surplus either by increasing this or decreasing this. So you have to ensure that goods are produced by sellers with lowest cost and consumed by buyers who value them the most. Under perfect competition, market outcome is efficient. Whenever you try to alter the market outcome, it will reduce the total surplus. Okay, with this we come to an end of this chapter. A very, very important chapter, not only for basic economics, but intermediate and advanced level of economics also. Very, very important chapter.